He had been called Jaqen Hagar once. He had been called 100 other names before that, and he would be called 100 more before he was done. In the ancient corridors of the House of Black and White, he had no name at all. He was merely a servant of the many-faced god, a disciple of the Faceless Men. Faces were interchangeable, souls traded, debts collected. In Bravos, coins chinked on dusty tables, trades were brokered in hushed corners, and somewhere in the gloom of the temple halls, prayers were offered. Faceless men kept their own counsel, made their own plans, too. The one who had gone by Jaqen Hagar was no exception. He had once been in Yoren's wagon, passing himself off as some lowlife from the dungeons of King's Landing, shackled together with other criminals. It was not by chance that he ended up there, for the Faceless Men seldom left anything to fate. In that moment, Arya Stark was but a curious child, skinny as a feral cat, with vengeance shining in her eyes. She did not know him, and he did not truly know her, yet their meeting had been predicted by the Faceless Order. She was an arrow pointed at the heart of the Lannisters, and the Faceless Men had an interest in what would come of that arrow, if only it could be guided. Many nights, he had watched her from the corner of his eye, noticing her resilience, her courage, and her thirst for justice. She was a slip of a girl, yet inside, the fires of Winterfell still burned hot. Word traveled even beyond the seas that Tywin Lannister, Hand of the King, Lord of Casterly Rock, cornerstone of the Lannister might, had relocated to Harrenhal. That cursed fortress of blackened stone and twisted towers was no place for a man of reason and strategy. Yet Tywin had chosen it because it stood near the heart of the Riverlands, an optimal vantage from which to quell any unrest. The War of the Five Kings raged, with a boy king on the Iron Throne, Robb Stark crowned in the north, Stannis Baratheon calling himself the rightful heir, Renly gathering men in the south, and Balon Greyjoy seizing the moment to strike the northwestern coasts. Amid this chaos, another chaos quietly brewed, the silent chaos of the Faceless Men. Their agenda was as old as Valyria's doom, older even, woven from the secret traditions and the many pacts of the House of Black and White. Jaqen Hagar had known that his time in the Riverlands was only a prelude. There were names whispered in the darkness, names that needed crossing off from the ledger of the many-faced god. Yet beneath the surface, the aims of the Faceless Men had twisted from a mere contract into a grander design, one that only a handful within the temple's halls had even guessed at. The Lannisters had grown too powerful, their gold shining across the seas. Their manipulations of currency, alliances with the Iron Bank, and tight hold on trade routes had ripples that reached all the way into Bravos. Rumors said that the Lannisters were indebted to the Iron Bank, but the House of Black and White had deeper knowledge. The Lannisters might soon stand in a position to exploit or undermine the bank's power. And the Iron Bank was a dangerous friend to displease. So there came an opportunity, an opening, a contract, a vow to strike. Jaqen was appointed to facilitate that strike. When Arya saved him from the fires, Jaqen told her she had stolen 3 deaths from the Red God. In truth, the Faceless Men served the many-faced god, a god of death in all its guises. It was only natural that a life saved must be answered by another life taken. But he also recognized something in the Stark girl. She carried a list of names whispered in the night: Cersei Lannister, the Mountain, Island Pain, Joffrey Baratheon, her nightly prayers brimming with hate. She was a vessel that could be filled with the knowledge of the Faceless Men. If nurtured, she might become an instrument of these quiet designs. And so he paid close attention to her, indulged her desire to name those who had offended her, and made himself her lethal ally. A man must do as a man must do, he would say, with that small smile curling his lips. But truly, he was neither man nor ally. He was a faceless man. The initial plan was never so grand as regicide. The target list had been smaller. But as fortune would have it, the chaos of the war gave birth to opportunity. When Tywin packed up his things at Harrenhal and prepared to leave, Jaqen departed as well, delivering his warnings to Arya, telling her that if ever she needed him, she could call upon the Faceless Men with a coin of Vala Morgulis. The swirl of cloak, the turn of the face, and he was gone. And yet he had not gone far. Deep in the forest along the roads that twisted through the Riverlands, Jaqen followed the route that Tywin's retinue would take. He donned a new face, old scars, an unkempt beard, and a half-ruined ear. He became a sellsword, a nondescript outrider, one more stray dog sniffing around the Lannister camp. The Lannisters did not suspect him. Who would suspect a man they had never seen before, a face that did not exist a month prior? Tywin Lannister was a careful man. No one rose to his power by being careless. But care could be outmaneuvered by patience and cunning. Late one evening, the Golden Lion had retired to his camp tent. The main body of his host spread out on the rolling fields to the west. His personal guard had grown lax after a day of forced marches. Fires winked in the darkness. Men told ribald jokes. Wine was passed around. Tywin was reading a missive by candlelight, something about the negotiations with the Tyrells, when Jaqen entered. The guards at the tent flap had parted for a sellsword wearing the colors of the Lannister outriders. They saw only a crooked nose, a battered shield at his back, and the dirt of a day's ride. As soon as he stepped inside, Tywin peered up, suspicious, certain he had not summoned any outrider at this hour. One man outside the tent door coughed, then collapsed, a dagger in his throat, the kill silent. Another tried to turn, but a second dagger found his lungs. By the time the first guard's body hit the grass, Jaqen was already beside Tywin. The old lion looked up with wide eyes. His arms snapped upward to defend himself, but Jaqen was too swift. A slender needle-like blade, dull in color but honed to a perfect point, pressed against Tywin's throat. Had Jaqen wanted, the old man would have died that instant. But Jaqen had been given instructions from Bravos. He was to offer Tywin a chance. To pay. The Faceless Men were not assassins for hire alone. They also tested the measure of those they were about to kill. Some died swiftly, some were allowed words, and sometimes, though rarely, certain debts could be repaid. "Name your price," Tywin rasped, understanding in a flash that this was no ordinary sellsword. "Gold? Land? A seat at the table? Vala Morgulis," Jaqen replied in a voice half-whisper, half-hiss. "All men must die, Lord Lannister. A price was set for you long ago." "What price? Name it. I'll exceed it." But the old man's calm belied the mortal fear in his eyes. He had faced enemies many times, had orchestrated massacres of entire houses. Yet this single man with a blade at his throat made him tremble. He could not wave an army forward now. He could not strike a deal with the devils behind those dark eyes. For the devil was already upon him. Jaqen needed only flick his wrist. And so, Tywin made one last plea, promising a sum that would see entire fleets built for Bravos, promising to match any offer the Iron Bank might have laid at the Faceless Men's feet. But the swirling designs of the House of Black and White were older than the Iron Bank. Even if Tywin matched or exceeded their price, the Lannisters' growing power threatened the balance that the Faceless Men maintained. And so the blade pressed deeper, found flesh, found arteries, found life's blood. Tywin Lannister's last breath gurgled in his throat. That proud mouth fell slack, and so ended the reign of the fearsome lion who had shaped half the Seven Kingdoms with his cunning. Outside, the camp was silent. The two guards lay in expanding pools of dark blood. Jaqen wiped his dagger on Tywin's sleeve, turned, and vanished into the night. In the morning, there would be outcry, alarm, men crying that the lion was slaughtered while they slept. But by then, the sellsword with the battered shield was gone. Some might recall glimpsing him, but no one would remember his face clearly. That was the magic and the simple skill of the Faceless Men. News of Tywin's death spread like wildfire. It hit King's Landing hardest, where the boy King Joffrey was still growing accustomed to power under the watchful eye of his mother. Cersei Lannister received the news in the throne room. Her face drained of color, and she stumbled for a seat. The entire court froze in that moment, as if the wind had been knocked out of them. Varys's eyes flickered with concern, or something else. Littlefinger stroked his chin. Grand Maester Pycelle dropped his chain of office in shock. For so long, Tywin had been the unshakable pillar, the unbreakable rock upon which the Lannisters built their empire. And now he was gone. Cersei raged like a storm unleashed on the throne room. She demanded to know who was responsible, how it was done, what incompetent fools allowed it. She spewed threats about flaying every soldier in Tywin's retinue. Jaime, who was busy at the time with his own struggles, felt horror and guilt claw at him when the news found him. His father gone. The Lannisters had always been about family, blood, legacy. Suddenly, that legacy stood on tremulous ground. Joffrey was a child king who had more petulance than sense, and Cersei, though cunning, had rarely done well without her father's firm guidance. Lord Tywin's death meant an immediate power vacuum, and the vultures would soon circle. The Tyrells, the Martells, the Starks, the Greyjoys, everyone would see this as an opportunity. Some believed that perhaps Robb Stark was behind it, or maybe the Brotherhood without banners, or a champion of House Tully seeking revenge for the Red Wedding, which hadn't yet transpired in this alternate swirl of events. Conspiracies abounded. Not once did anyone suspect the House of Black and White, or that a single man had moved in the dark to do the deed. And so they reeled, unprepared for what would come next. For Jaqen had not left Westeros. He had more work to do. Arya Stark had escaped Harrenhal with Gendry and Hot Pie. She led them through forests and fields, determined to find her mother and brother. The War of the Five Kings had turned the countryside into a patchwork of burned farms and rotting corpses. At night, Arya whispered her list of names. Cersei, Joffrey, Island Pain, Meryn Trant, the Mountain. Sometimes she remembered that Jaqen had told her she had only to speak the words and give the coin to any Braavosi, and the Faceless Men would answer. She didn't trust him entirely. Her father had warned her about trusting those with hidden intentions. Yet there was a part of her that believed in the red-haired man with the strange manner of speech. Even after he changed his face, she held the coin he gave her, a battered piece of metal with unfamiliar markings. She had it hidden in a secret pocket. Sometimes she pulled it out at night, staring at it in the moonlight, reciting quietly, Vala Morgulis. She did not yet know that Tywin Lannister was dead by the man's hand. She could guess that war was tilting in her brother's favor, because if Tywin had left Harrenhal, that meant something big was about to happen. But she did not guess that the entire continent would soon be upended by a series of assassinations. She was a girl trying to survive, to make her way home, or at least to whatever family she had left. Days became weeks, and the group avoided Lannister scouts. They came upon travelers who sometimes carried scraps of news. One such traveler, an old man on a donkey cart, mentioned that Tywin Lannister had been discovered dead in his tent. Arya was certain she hadn't heard correctly. She pressed him for details, and the man said that Tywin's own men found him with his throat slit. Rumors claimed that the camp had been infiltrated by enemies, Stark men disguised as outriders. Or it was the Brotherhood, or it was bandits. Arya's heart pounded in her chest. She remembered Jaqen. She remembered his deadly skill, how quickly he dispatched the tickler, how he had manipulated the guards. Could it be? Hot Pie shivered at the news. Gendry grimaced, but Arya said nothing. As they rode away, the wheels of her mind turned. There was no proof, but she could almost feel Jaqen's presence in the rumor. She remembered that final moment in Harrenhal, that subtle promise in his voice. He had offered to kill 3 men for her. She had named the wrong men, perhaps, or maybe not. She tried to bury the thought. It made her uneasy to think that if she had spoken Tywin's name, it would have come true even sooner. King's Landing did not remain in disarray for long. Tywin's death forced Cersei to scramble. She tightened her hold on Joffrey, pulling him closer, though the boy was by turns cruel and willful. Jaime returned from the field for a short time, uncertain what to do about the transition of power. The small council was in uproar. Peter Baelish, ever the opportunist, saw a chance to further his ambitions, maybe by offering comfort or subtle suggestions to Cersei. Varys remained quiet, watchful. The city itself bristled with tension. The people, half-starving, had pinned much of their hope on Tywin's competence in the war. With him gone, who would hold the realm together? Cersei found her nights sleepless. She would pace the halls of the Red Keep, wearing a robe of crimson silk, half sure that assassins lurked behind every wall hanging. Her father's murder had been so sudden, so unexpected. If it could happen to Tywin Lannister, it could happen to her. And so she fortified herself with guards, doubling the watch, restricting access to the king, ordering Qyburn to devise new ways to keep them safe from silent killers. It was never enough. She saw the shadows dancing on the walls. She heard footsteps behind her when none were there. Meanwhile, across the sea in Bravos, the House of Black and White continued its rituals. Water dripped in dark pools beneath the carved pillars, and silent acolytes tended the candles that burned day and night. A new contract had been authorized, another step in the plan to destabilize the Lannister power in Westeros. The next name was written in the hidden ledgers. A message was sent to Jaqen, though he was not truly Jaqen anymore, but it was easiest to still think of him that way. He had remained in Westeros, moving like a ghost through towns and castles, waiting for instructions. When the instructions came, he needed no further impetus. He set out for the capital, brandishing a new face. One evening, Cersei Lannister hosted a gathering in the Red Keep, a feast meant to consolidate alliances and reassure the great houses. Lords from the Crownlands and the Reach attended, though the Tyrells were largely absent, citing the war's demands. Representatives of Dorne were there too. Oberyn Martell was rumored to be arriving soon, though not yet present. The great hall was hung with crimson banners, gold lions rampant, the flicker of torchlight adding an orange glow to the tapestries. Musicians played softly, and servants circulated with wine. Cersei wore a gown of green velvet sewn with gold thread, her hair piled high in a show of regal authority. Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne, bored out of his wits. Meryn Trant and Boros Blunt guarded him from either side. Though the king's guard was shorter than usual, Jaime was absent. The Mountain, Ser Gregor Clegane, stood near a pillar at the far end of the hall, looking like a statue carved of granite. His presence alone, huge and hulking, was enough to keep unruly lords from speaking out of turn. He wore plain plate armor, no sigil but for a faint sun-bleached mark of House Clegane. They called him Tywin's Mad Dog, but now that Tywin was gone, it was said he served Cersei's will. Into this feast slipped an unremarkable man in the livery of House Rosby, one of the lesser Crownlands houses. No one gave him a second glance. His face was sallow, his hair dull, his eyes watery. He played the part of a minor retainer, offering greetings to a few knights from other houses, talking of supply lines, the shortage of grain, the threat from Storm's End, standard political chatter. The entire time, he never drew attention to himself. That was key. To be a faceless man was to be a whisper in the wind, a shape that melted into the crowd. As the feast wore on, Cersei rose to toast the memory of Tywin Lannister, praising the father who had guided her and led the kingdom in its darkest hour. Her voice trembled with a mixture of sorrow and anger. Joffrey sniffed, bored, impatient for more amusements. The lords and ladies lowered their heads in solemn respect, though many had their own private thoughts about the old lion. The Mountain stood unmoving by the pillar, scanning the room like a monstrous sentinel, as if by intimidation alone he could keep any assassin at bay. But assassins do not typically walk through the front door, unless they wear a face no one suspects. When the toasts were done, the final course was served, rich pastries stuffed with shredded meat and sweet cream. Wine poured freely. The sallow-faced retainer took up a goblet and offered one to Cersei, stepping close. The guards allowed it because he wore the livery of House Rosby. Must have been a known retainer, or so they presumed. The ruse was simple. Cersei, lost in her swirling thoughts, accepted the goblet without looking at him. He bowed and moved away. She drank. Moments later, as the conversation resumed, her face flickered with confusion. She felt a sudden tightness in her throat. Her eyes darted around the hall. She tried to speak, but her lips parted only in a silent gasp. Some poisons are quick, some are slow. The Faceless Men had specialized in 100 different tinctures that might appear to be a stroke or heart failure. This poison, carefully concocted, did its work in under a minute. Cersei's fingers began to tremble. She set her goblet down, but it slipped from her grip, clattering on the stone floor. Heads turned. A hush settled. Joffrey rose to his feet, alarmed. Meryn Trant stepped forward, calling for maesters. But already, a grayness was creeping over Cersei's skin, her breath rasping in her lungs. She reached for Joffrey with desperate arms, but she could not speak. Then she collapsed. Her head hit the floor with a dull thud. Panic erupted. Several ladies screamed. Lords jumped from their seats. The Mountain snarled, drawing his massive sword. In the confusion, no one noticed the sallow-faced retainer quietly slip out of a side entrance. By the time they realized that Cersei Lannister, Queen Regent, was gone from the world, the assassin had melted into the corridors of the Red Keep. Guards ran to every door, but found only throngs of frantic guests. Some pointed one way, some another. The man from House Rosby was nowhere to be seen. It was rumored he had left hours ago. Another insisted he was still among them. But none recognized his face well enough to say for sure. The city spiraled into immediate hysteria. Cersei Lannister, dead, mere weeks after Tywin. 2 pillars of House Lannister toppled. The boy king was left unmoored, and with him the entire court. Lords whispered of curses, black magic, or the revenge of the old Targaryen blood. Others guessed the Tyrells had arranged it, or that the Martells had enacted vengeance for Elia. King Joffrey, only a youth, roared with fury, ordering the heads of anyone who had even looked suspicious. Scores were dragged to the dungeons. Pycelle babbled about vile toxins. Qyburn quietly examined the body, and the Hound, who had not yet fled, looked on with something akin to disgust. Meanwhile, the Mountain had only begun to seethe. His entire existence was violence, and he seethed at the intangible threat that had robbed him of a chance to protect his masters. He would not let it happen again. In the north, Robb Stark heard the news with astonishment. He had not known who orchestrated these killings, but he saw an advantage. With Tywin gone, and Cersei gone, the Lannister hold on King's Landing was precarious. Joffrey was a child king hated by the populace, and the only truly formidable warrior left in the family was Jaime, who had lost a hand, or was rumored to soon lose it in other timelines. Regardless, the Lannisters were weakened. If Robb pressed south swiftly, he might force the city to yield. Yet there were still formidable obstacles. The Red Keep's defenses, the Gold Cloaks, loyal to whoever paid them, and the mighty Gregor Clegane. The rumor was that the Mountain had returned to the capital to stand at Joffrey's side. If so, that was a foe Robb did not relish facing. Still, the war demanded boldness. At the Twins, Walder Frey cackled in delight at the news that Tywin Lannister was dead. He had disliked the man's arrogance. Yet he also saw the danger. Without Tywin, certain alliances might not be honored. He had his own grudges, but for the moment, kept them in check. In the Eyrie, Lisa Arryn wrung her hands, uncertain which way the tide might turn. She wanted no part in the war, but events were pulling everyone inexorably into the maelstrom. In Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon listened to the tidings from King's Landing and allowed himself a small, grim smile. If the Lannisters were crumbling, that meant a path might open for the one true king. Melisandre insisted it was the Lord of Light punishing the Lannisters, but Stannis was not so sure. Men kill men, that's the way of the world, he thought. But none suspected the Faceless Men. None realized that a quiet orchestrator was removing key figures of House Lannister to reshape the board. One piece remained: Gregor Clegane. The instructions from Braavos were explicit. The Mountain must be taken from the game as well. In the labyrinthine logic of the House of Black and White, the Mountain represented not just raw brutality, but a kind of unstoppable violence that had been harnessed by the Lannisters for too long. Sever that final anchor, and the rest of the kingdom would reel. Then the Faceless Men could proceed with the final phase of their designs, which might remain hidden even from Jaqen's immediate knowledge. Such is the nature of that ancient guild. Each operative knows only what he must do, not why. Tension in King's Landing soared. The city stank of fear and uncollected refuse. Peddlers hawked charms to ward off spirits. Gold cloaks patrolled in larger numbers, but that only made the small folk more uneasy. They remembered how the gold cloaks had turned on Ned Stark once upon a time. With Cersei's death, Joffrey's cruelty became more pronounced. His paranoia soared. He demanded that the city gates be locked at night, that no one enter or leave without thorough inspection. He forced Pycelle to test his food for poison. He even had the kennel dogs taste from his plates before he ate, leading to the death of a few unfortunate hounds. The madness of the Boy King was on full display. By his side stood the Mountain, glowering at everyone with his cold, pitiless eyes. He was more a beast than a man, rumored to be nearly 8 feet tall, though that might have been an exaggeration. He wore heavy plate, carried a massive greatsword, and was known to split men in half with a single swing. The small council was effectively beholden to him in these uncertain times. None dared voice dissent openly. But it is said that no matter how tall a man stands, the blade in the dark can still find his neck. And so it was that the final stage of Jaqen's mission took form. He studied the Mountain for a time from the vantage of a beggar boy who lingered near the gates. He watched the huge knight ride out with a retinue, searching for outlaws in the hills. He saw how the people shrank from him. He observed the routes, the patterns. The Mountain was not easy prey. He was always armed, always suspicious, always savage. A straightforward approach would be suicide. Poison might work if someone could slip it into his cup, but the man was not known to drink anything that had not already been tested, especially after Cersei's demise. Another approach would be needed. Joffrey's wedding loomed, a lavish event that was somehow still planned, because the realm needed morale, so said the small council. To the surprise of many, the wedding was not postponed despite the Queen Regent's death. Margaery Tyrell's presence in the capital had begun to smooth tensions, as her sweet words and charitable acts offered hope to the small folk. The Tyrells were consolidating power, forging alliances with the crown, trying to keep the city from fully erupting. The Mountain, for his part, was slated to be the king's champion in the tourney held in conjunction with the wedding festivities. That would offer a rare chance, Jaqen realized. When the day of the tourney came, the city was abuzz. Knights from across the land came to compete. Some for glory, some for the chance to earn favor with King Joffrey and the Tyrells. The stands were hung with bright banners, the smell of horse sweat and dust mixing with the perfume of lords and ladies. Joffrey sat in a specially built box with Margaery at his side. The Boy King wore a smug grin. The Mountain, clad in brutal black armor, stood behind him. The crowd parted like water wherever Gregor Clegane walked. Jaqen found his way into the stables, wearing the face of a hedge knight's squire. He tended the horses, brushed their coats, made quiet conversation with the real squires. He observed the Mountain's warhorse, a monstrous stallion nearly as large as a small destrier, black as pitch. It snorted and stamped at any who came too close. Only a select few dared feed it or remove its tack. Jaqen carefully approached it, murmuring soothing nonsense. The stallion eyed him, but allowed him to stroke its neck. In that moment, as the stallion's big brown eye flicked to meet his, Jaqen slipped a small needle into the horse's flesh, drawing not blood but injecting a subtle agent. Another poison, but this one was not lethal to horses. This agent, derived from exotic plants in Sithorios, caused agitation and fear. He left no visible mark. When the hour for the Mountain to ride out for the justs arrived, the horse was saddled, bridled, and led onto the field. Gregor Clegane climbed atop the beast. The stallion trembled, sweat shining on its flanks. Initially, it obeyed, for the Mountain's grip was strong. The horn sounded, the justs began, knights charged in thunderous passes. The crowd cheered as lances shattered on shields. In the first tilt, Gregor unhorsed a knight from the Vale with ease, sending him crashing into the dirt. Joffrey clapped, thoroughly amused. Yet by the second tilt, the agent began to work. The stallion grew restless, eyes rolling white. Gregor snarled at the beast, spurring it roughly. They thundered down the list, but the stallion lurched sideways at the last moment, nearly pitching the Mountain out of the saddle. Clegane's lance missed entirely, the crowd gasping at the spectacle. The knight across from him, though surprised, landed a glancing blow on Gregor's shield. Furious, Gregor yanked the reins, cursing the horse, nearly snapping its neck. The poor creature let out a tormented shriek. Then all at once it reared, toppling backward. Gregor tumbled off, hitting the ground with a mighty clang of steel. Laughter swept through some parts of the stands. Who had ever seen the fearsome mountain dethroned by his own horse? Gregor was not a man to suffer embarrassment lightly. He seized his sword, bellowing at the squires who rushed forward. The horse scrambled to its feet, panicked. The crowd watched in horror as the mountain swung his blade at the poor beast in a blind rage, nearly decapitating it on the spot. Blood spurted across the dusty field, horrified gasps echoing through the stands. The horse collapsed, flailing, as Gregor turned to face his opponent. The entire tourney ground froze, uncertain what was happening. Even the heralds stood speechless. Then, in that dreadful hush, another figure stepped onto the list, wearing the drab armor of a lesser knight. A visor concealed the face. The figure held a sword in one hand, a dagger in the other. Gregor bared his teeth, his monstrous visage contorted with fury. He had no patience for challengers now. But the figure moved with uncanny grace, stepping lightly over the churned dirt, approaching the mountain as if unafraid of his towering form. The crowd was too stunned to react. The heralds had lost control. Joffrey shouted from his seat, demanding the guards seize this fool. The gold cloaks began to move, but they were still yards away. Gregor roared and charged. His footfalls rattled the ground. He swung his greatsword in a devastating arc. The lesser knight seemed to flow under the blow, letting it pass overhead. In a blink, the knight was at Gregor's flank, dagger lancing out. Gregor twisted, but the dagger slid across a gap in his armor. Steel screeched. Gregor struck out with a mailed fist, connecting with the knight's helm. The blow would have shattered the skull of a smaller man, but the knight rolled with it, staggering back. For a moment, the knight nearly fell. Gregor pressed forward, hacking downward. The lesser knight deflected with the sword, though sparks flew. Then, in a flurry of motion that the watchers could scarcely follow, the dagger stabbed again, and again, and again. Joints in armor, the gaps near the armpit, the groin, the visor. Any vulnerable spot. Each stab was placed with lethal precision. Gregor roared like a wounded bull. He swung wildly, each blow heavier than the last. One glancing strike to the knight's side caved in a portion of the breastplate. The figure hissed in pain, reeling, but the dagger pressed in once more, this time finding the gap at Gregor's throat. Blood spurted across the battered armor, black in the midday sun. Gregor gurgled, dropping his greatsword. He swayed, teetered, tried to grab at the knight, but his legs gave out. The crowd watched in stunned horror and awe as the mountain fell to his knees, blood bubbling in his helm. He tried to speak or curse, but only strangled air emerged. Then he slumped forward, face down in the dirt, the metallic crash echoing through the hush. The unstoppable beast had been slain. Only then did the guards swarm. Crossbowmen aimed their weapons. The lesser knight raised both hands in mock surrender, but as half a dozen men rushed in, the knight moved with uncanny speed, parrying a thrust, knocking aside a pike, spinning under a sword slash. A crossbow bolt whizzed by, nicking the shoulder pauldron. But the knight seemed to vanish into the swirl of steel, weaving among the guards. More bolts flew, some striking the ground. Within moments, the figure had broken clear, racing across the field. The watchers in the stands shrieked or shouted. Joffrey screamed for them to shoot, to kill the assassin, promising gold beyond measure. Guards on horseback charged, but the figure leapt over the low wooden barrier, darting behind a stable. By the time the horses circled around, there was no sign of the lesser knight. Gone, like a ghost. Pandemonium ensued. The tourney was abandoned. Marjorie Tyrell was whisked back to safety. The gold cloaks combed the area, turning over every stall, every wagon. They found no trace of the killer. On the field, the body of Gregor Clegane was eventually lifted onto a cart. every eye gaping at the numerous wounds that marred his immense form. The realm's most feared knight, brought low in a matter of heartbeats. Some said the assassin fought like Sirio Farrell, the Braavosi water dancer, though that was but speculation. Others insisted it was Oberyn Martell's revenge. But the Red Viper had not even arrived in the city yet. Whispers abounded, but no one had the truth. Joffrey's fury could not be contained. He wanted blood, anyone's blood. He wanted the entire city scoured. He wanted heads on spikes. Yet behind the scenes, power shifted yet again. With the mountain gone, a major bulwark of the Lannister intimidation factor had fallen. Jaime Lannister, if present, would be the last true pillar, but he was increasingly isolated. Tywin was gone, Cersei was gone, Gregor was gone. Joffrey had only the Hound, who was himself half out the door, losing faith in the boy king's madness. Kevin Lannister might have stepped in to guide the family, but events were spinning too fast for him to seize control effectively. The ripple effects spread across the realm. The Tyrells grew bolder, the Martells prepared to exact vengeance for Elia more openly. The Iron Islands probed the western shores. The North saw a chance to finalize its independence. Chaos was indeed a ladder, and many scrambled to climb it. Far to the west, Arya Stark heard rumors that the Mountain, who had killed so many in the Riverlands, was dead. She sat by a small campfire with Gendry and a band of outlaws, listening to a grizzled man recount what he'd heard from travelers coming up the Gold Road. "Slain at the king's tourney," he said, "by a faceless knight who cut him to pieces in front of everyone, then vanished without a trace." A faceless knight. Arya's heart pounded. Faceless. She remembered Jaqen's face changing in front of her eyes back at Harrenhal. She remembered the coin, the words, Vala Morgulus. Could it be? Her mind reeled. Tywin, Cersei, the Mountain, three of the names she had always hated, though Joffrey still lived. She gazed into the flames, imagining them swirling with visions of this unstoppable phantom who moved in the shadows. A part of her felt relief. Those monsters were gone from the world. But another part of her worried what it might mean. The Lannisters had undone her family, but all these killings might unleash something worse. She could not say what that might be. Some nights, she sat awake, thinking of the House of Black and White. She remembered Jaqen's invitation to come to Braavos. Perhaps she could learn to do what he did, to avenge her family, to cross off every name on her list. She touched the coin he had given her. It felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of destinies. She did not yet realize how drastically these faceless killings would change the tide of war. She only knew that the Lannisters, once so mighty, now seemed vulnerable as a wounded stag. Perhaps the gods were giving the Starks a chance. Or perhaps other forces, older and more elusive than the gods, were pulling the strings. Back in Braavos, the kindly man received word that the deeds had been done. Acolytes bowed their heads as they heard the news. The coin was placed in the bowl. The name was crossed out from the ledger. But there were more names, more lines. The agenda of the Faceless Men stretched beyond just toppling a single house. The many-faced god demanded balance, demanded certain destinies unfold. The Lannisters had grown too proud, too meddlesome in the affairs of Braavos. Now they had been cut down to size. Next might come the Targaryens if they rose again, or the Baratheons, or some other threat. The Faceless Men served not the petty politics of kings, but the deeper currents of death that underpinned all mortal affairs. Jaqen, or the man once called Jaqen, slipped away from King's Landing, traveling the countryside under yet another face. In a small village inn, he overheard talk of the Northern Rebellion, the savage Boltons, the quarreling Greyjoys. He sipped a cup of watered wine, silent as always. People told stories of the Lannisters' downfall as if it were an omen. Some believed the Lannisters were cursed by the old gods for their crimes. Others believed the Targaryens had conjured some black art from across the narrow sea. Many repeated rumors of a faceless knight or a faceless phantom that made Jaqen smile faintly beneath his new visage. A traveling bard plucked at his lute, singing a ballad about the lion that lost its roar. Patrons at the inn muttered about how the realm might tear itself apart now, with no strong family to keep a semblance of order. Jaqen wondered how it would unfold. Would the Tyrells step in and claim the throne through Margaery's marriage to Joffrey? Would the Martells seize the chance to exact vengeance and possibly claim the seat for themselves? Or ally with the Targaryen girl rumored to be across the sea? The Vale might remain aloof, or might be stirred to action by Littlefinger's ambitions. The North might break free entirely if Robb Stark pressed his advantage. So many possibilities, so many faces. He set his cup down, left a small coin that glimmered in the lantern light, and departed. He had a task to do, for the House of Black and White was not finished in Westeros. The cracks had been made, but the shape of the final outcome was still uncertain. Perhaps the realm would collapse into endless war, and from its ashes, new seeds would sprout. Perhaps a new equilibrium would form with different alliances. The Faceless Men did not truly care which it would be, only that the tides of death and life continued in their grand cosmic dance. Meanwhile, in the Red Keep, Joffrey howled in impotent rage. The heads of suspects rolled. Whole households were imprisoned. Gold cloaks manned every gate, searching for ghosts who had already disappeared. Kevin tried to restore some order, but the Boy King dismissed his counsel. Fear ruled the city. Stannis saw a moment to strike, but found his path complicated by the sudden aggression of the Tyrells, who were determined to defend their hold on King's Landing through Margaery's claim. Roose Bolton, in the north, contemplated his next moves. The Freys wondered which side to betray. The realm balanced on a razor's edge. Arya Stark continued her lonely journey, hearing more news each day. Death was everywhere in the land. Villages burned, armies clashed, crowns changed hands. Yet the three biggest names on her prayer list, Tywin, Cersei, the Mountain, were gone, removed by some unknown hand. It gave her a sense that maybe, just maybe, the gods listened, or something more tangible had heard her prayers. Often, she slipped the coin from her pocket, rolling it between her fingers. Would she dare speak the words and call upon that power again? The part of her that still clung to the old gods said that death on such a scale might demand a steep price. She was young, but she was no longer naive. Death begets death, and each kill sends ripples across the world. She wondered if that was what the Faceless Men truly wanted, a realm so chaotic that their influence could flourish. She remembered Jaqen's quiet smile, his kindly voice, the way he spoke of the Red God and the many-faced God. The more she thought, the more she realized that everything from Harrenhal onward had been part of some grander design, one she could not comprehend. And she wondered if she had inadvertently played a role in unleashing that design by giving him those three names. True, she had not named Tywin or Cersei or the Mountain at the time, but her presence and her vengeance had put him in proximity to them. Perhaps she was the catspaw, or the reason he lingered in Harrenhal as long as he did. Arya pressed her lips together, trying not to dwell on it. The world was too large, too dark, and she was only a girl with a sword named Needle. Yet still, she recited her list at night. Joffrey, Island Payne, Meryn Trant, Walder Frey. She knew the first name might soon be crossed off anyway if the realm turned on the Boy King. But she kept him in her prayers or her curses. One day, she told herself, she would learn to wield the kind of power that ends lives at will. Or maybe she would find a different path, one that led her away from endless bloodshed. Only time would tell. Months passed. The realm shook with aftershocks from the Lannisters' downfall. Joffrey's wedding ended in uneasy celebration, overshadowed by his mother's death. The Tyrells tried to cling to power, though Margaery found Joffrey a poor husband indeed. The cunning lords of the small council scrambled to fill the vacuum left by Tywin's absence. Peter Baelish grew bolder in his machinations, orchestrating deals and marriages to benefit himself. Varys listened for the slightest hint that the Targaryen girl across the sea was preparing to invade. Yara Greyjoy staged raids along the coast, sensing that the Lannisters could no longer muster a strong naval response. Roose Bolton negotiated with the Freys to tighten his hold on the north. The entire chessboard was changed, and in that swirl, the Faceless Men continued their quiet watch. No one knew that the House of Black and White had orchestrated the pivotal blows that started the chain reaction, and so they were free to act further if needed. Perhaps they had set their sights on other powerful figures, or perhaps their mission was complete. Jaqen, or the man who had once been Jaqen, received no new name to cross off. Instead, a cryptic message arrived from Braavos. The debt is paid. Await the next coin. He understood that to mean he should remain in Westeros, watchful, ready if the house needed him again. If the swirl of events demanded another push, he would be there to deliver it. On a cold morning, he stood on a high ridge overlooking the Blackwater Rush, wearing yet another face, that of a traveling merchant with a ragged mustache. He gazed at King's Landing in the distance. The Red Keep perched above the city like a bleeding scab. Smoke curled from chimneys, the city alive with countless souls scurrying about their business. 1,000 stories wove together below, but for him, it was all just a tapestry upon which the many-faced god might place his next design. Tywin was gone, Cersei was gone, Gregor was gone, and the realm had become a place of shifting alliances and fresh terrors. Perfect breeding ground for change. He allowed himself a small, private smile. Then, turning from the wind, he walked along the ridge, disappearing over the crest. In the days to come, some might claim they saw a merchant heading north, or a hedge knight riding west, or a bard traveling with a lute. But all descriptions would differ and none would truly match. A face is a tool, after all, as easily exchanged as a coin. And so Westeros stood on the brink. The Starks rallied in the north, though winter was always looming. The Baratheons contested the throne, albeit divided among themselves. The Tyrells, the Martells, the Greyjoys, the Vale, each shaped their own designs. And somewhere in the shadows, the Faceless Men watched, prepared to nudge events with another death, another well-placed cut of the blade, if it served their higher purpose. Few knew of their existence, fewer still understood their goal, but the name Faceless Men began to creep into rumor and legend, spoken in hushed tones by those who sensed that something beyond normal politics had touched the realm. A phantom hand guiding fate. Vala Morgulus, they whispered. All men must die. And indeed they do, especially when the Faceless Men decide their time has come. As for Arya Stark, she would eventually cross the narrow sea, driven by a combination of fate and longing for revenge, to knock on the doors of the House of Black and White with the coin Jaqen had given her. Perhaps the kindly man would greet her, or perhaps she would be tested by others first. But that is a tale for another time. For now the seeds were sown. The deaths of Tywin, Cersei, and the Mountain had reverberated throughout every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. The lion's roar had been silenced, replaced by the uncertain hush of a realm without its once mighty guardians. The center of power shifted, forging new alliances, birthing new horrors. And somewhere far off, in the gloom of that ancient temple, the priests of the many-faced god would watch the results of their quiet manipulations with serene detachment. After all, to them, death was but a gift, and the gift had been given thrice over to the proudest house in the land, Vala Morgulus.